My name is Matthew Carter. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where the loudest people in the room are usually the ones who get remembered. I've never been one of those people. I'm the kind of person coworkers often describe with words like reliable, steady, or sometimes the slightly more backhanded compliment, quiet but nice. In meetings, I'm usually the one taking notes, while someone else presents the idea. In project groups, I'm the one who double-checks the numbers, fixes the spreadsheets, or cleans up documentation after everyone else has moved on to the next thing. It's not that I mind the work. In fact, I've always preferred it that way, because when you're quiet, people tend to assume things about you. They assume you're less ambitious, less aware, sometimes even less capable. Over the years, I've learned that being underestimated has a strange side effect. It makes you invisible in ways that can be frustrating, but also strangely powerful. The story I'm about to tell you isn't about revenge. It's not about dramatic confrontations or someone storming out of an office shouting accusations. Life rarely unfolds like that anyway. Real consequences tend to arrive slowly, almost quietly, like the weather changing while people are still talking about yesterday's forecast. This happened 3 years ago at a mid-sized logistics consulting firm in Chicago, where I worked as a data systems analyst. My job wasn't glamorous, but it was important. I managed internal reporting structures, the quiet machinery behind the company's operational decisions. For nearly 9 months, I worked on a project that most people in the office barely noticed, until suddenly everyone did. 3 days before a major external audit, something happened that shouldn't have been possible. My coworker deleted 9 months of my work from the shared drive. Not a single folder, not just a document or two, everything. All the analysis models, all the audit preparation files, every version history is connected to the project, gone, at least. That's what everyone believed at first. What she didn't know, and what almost no one in that room realized, was that our system administrator had already implemented a backup protocol weeks earlier. And more importantly, I knew exactly how that system worked. But that part of the story comes later, because before something like that happens, before an entire room suddenly realizes they misunderstood someone sitting quietly among them, there are usually months of smaller moments, small dismissals, small assumptions, small decisions people barely remember making. Those moments are where the story really begins. So before we get there, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a place where people thought they understood you when they really didn't at all? In the office, I had a reputation, not the kind that shows up in performance reviews or company newsletters. The quieter kind, the kind people form without ever saying it out loud. To most of my coworkers, I was simply Matthew from data, the guy who fixed reports when numbers didn't add up, the guy who stayed late before deadlines, the guy who almost never argued in meetings. If someone accidentally broke a spreadsheet or lost track of a data set, my name usually came up within a few minutes. Matthew can probably fix it, and most of the time, I did. Part of that was personality. I've always been more comfortable solving problems than talking about them. While other people enjoyed presentations and brainstorming sessions, I liked the quiet work that happened afterward, the part where ideas actually had to function. But there was another side to that reputation. When you become a dependable person, people slowly start assuming something else. That you'll always fix things, that you won't complain, that you won't challenge them. And over time, that assumption quietly turns into a role. In meetings, I often noticed how people spoke around my work rather than to me. Managers would reference reports I created as if they had simply appeared overnight. Sometimes my models were used in presentations without anyone mentioning where they came from. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Recognition wasn't the point, the work was. And honestly, the arrangement suited me in some ways. Being underestimated gave me space to focus. No one questioned how I organized systems, or how carefully I tracked changes inside our project files. They simply assumed the quiet guy at the edge of the room was doing what he always did, maintaining things, cleaning up mistakes, making sure everything worked. What they didn't realize was that when you spend enough time quietly maintaining systems, you start understanding them better than anyone else in the building. And that understanding would eventually matter a lot more than anyone expected. The first moment something felt off didn't look like a big deal at the time. In fact, if you had walked past the conference room that morning, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. It was just another Tuesday project meeting. Our team was preparing for an upcoming external compliance audit, the kind companies treat very seriously because it can affect contracts, insurance, and long-term partnerships. My role in the project was simple on paper, but complicated in practice. I was responsible for building the data validation models the auditors would use to verify operational reports. In other words, I was building the foundation. The work itself took months. Cleaning datasets, building cross-check systems, and designing reports that could withstand the kind of scrutiny auditors are trained to apply. It wasn't glamorous, but if anything in that system failed, the entire review could unravel. That Tuesday morning, our project manager asked for an update. Before I could respond, Claire Donovan spoke first. Claire was one of the newer analysts on the team, confident, energetic, and very comfortable speaking in meetings. The kind of person who could summarize a complex situation quickly and sound convincing. While doing it, she leaned forward slightly, scrolling through the presentation on her laptop. "We've made a lot of progress on the audit models," she said. "I restructured the data mapping last week so the reports would be easier for the auditors to read." I remember blinking once, not because what she said was technically wrong, but because I had written those models. She continued talking calmly, explaining how the system worked. The validation layers, the reporting structure, and even the naming conventions inside the folders. Everything she described came directly from the framework I had built over the previous several months. No one interrupted. The room nodded along. Our manager glanced at the screen and said, "Great, that should make the audit smoother." I could have corrected it right there. A simple sentence would have been enough. Actually, I built that system, but something about the moment felt strangely delicate. Claire wasn't openly claiming credit in an aggressive way. She was just speaking with confidence, and the room accepted it. And I had spent years being the quiet one. So instead of interrupting, I did something else. I watched. The meeting moved on quickly. New tasks were assigned, deadlines adjusted, and another presentation was scheduled for the following week. By the time we stood up from the table, the moment had already dissolved into the routine rhythm of office work. As people left the room, Claire gave me a quick smile. "Hey, Matthew," she said casually. "Those datasets you organized last month helped a lot." Datasets, not models, not the system itself, just datasets. I nodded politely. "Glad they were useful," I said. And that could have been the end of it. A small misunderstanding in a busy office. But what stayed with me wasn't the credit itself. It was how easily the room had accepted the version of events that fit their expectations. Claire was visible. I wasn't. And for the first time, I started wondering what would happen if that pattern continued long enough. Because small moments like that rarely stay small. They tend to repeat, quietly, until one day, the consequences become impossible to ignore. After that meeting, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no awkward conversation in the hallway, no email correcting the misunderstanding. Work simply continued. And that was exactly how the pattern started to settle in. At first, Claire's comments during meetings stayed subtle. She didn't outright claim ownership of my work, but she spoke about the project in ways that slowly blurred the lines. When managers asked questions about the audit preparation, she often answered first. "The reporting structure should handle that. We already reorganized the validation layers. The team adjusted the models last week." The language was careful. We, the team, the system. But the details she described were almost always the pieces I had built. What surprised me most wasn't Claire. It was how quickly everyone else accepted the new dynamic. Over the following weeks, something small but noticeable began happening in meetings. When people discussed the audit system, their eyes gradually shifted toward Claire instead of me. Not because she had taken control of the project, but because she sounded like she had. Confidence fills the silence very easily in offices, and I was still the quiet one. At first, I told myself the same thing I always did. This isn't worth making into a problem. Office environments run on perception as much as reality. If you challenge every small misrepresentation, you risk looking defensive, difficult, overly sensitive. So I stayed focused on the work. Every morning, I opened the same folders, ran the same validation scripts, and checked the same datasets. The audit preparation was moving into its final phase, and the models were becoming more complex. There were layers of cross-references, automated checks, and reporting dashboards that needed to work perfectly before the auditors arrived. If something broke later, I knew exactly who would end up fixing it. Me. But the subtle shift in perception continued. One afternoon, our department director stopped by Claire's desk. I overheard part of the conversation from across the room. "Claire," he said, leaning slightly against the divider, "I heard you've been doing great work on the audit prep." She smiled politely. "Thanks. It's been a team effort." Again, careful language. Team effort. But the director nodded, as if the project clearly had a visible driver now. And that driver wasn't me. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. Instead, I did what I had started doing more often since that first meeting. I observed. I paid attention to who accessed which folders, who edited the files, who actually understood how the system worked. Because something else had become clear to me during those weeks. Claire was very good at presenting the structure, but she didn't fully understand the machinery behind it. She knew how to talk about the reports, but not how the validation layers connected. She could navigate the folders, but do not rebuild the system if something breaks. And that difference, the gap between appearance and reality, was invisible to almost everyone in the office. Except for the person who had built it. At the time, I still believed the situation would eventually correct itself. Eventually, someone would ask a technical question Claire couldn't answer. Eventually, the conversation would shift back toward the person actually maintaining the project. But workplaces don't always operate on accuracy. They operate on momentum, and by then, the momentum had already started moving in a direction no one seemed interested in questioning, except me, quietly. By the middle of the project, something had become quietly clear to me. Not through a conversation, not through a direct statement, but through a series of small moments that all pointed in the same direction. In the eyes of the team, I had already been assigned a role, the reliable one, the one who kept things running but didn't need recognition, the one who solved problems but didn't necessarily lead discussions, the one who stayed quiet. Roles like that don't get announced in offices. They simply form over time, shaped by habits and expectations. And once people settle into those expectations, they rarely question them. One afternoon, about 6 weeks before the audit, our team gathered again in the same conference room for a progress review. Claire was standing near the screen this time, walking everyone through the latest audit preparation timeline. I noticed something immediately. Several slides included screenshots of reporting dashboards. Dashboards I had built. The structure, the formatting, even the naming conventions were exactly the same. The folders they referenced were ones I had created months earlier when the project first started. Claire explained the system confidently. The reporting layers are designed to flag inconsistencies before the auditors see them, she said. So by the time the review happens, everything should already be validated. And technically, that description was accurate, but something about hearing it presented that way felt distant. Like listening to someone describe a house you built while standing inside it. Around the table, people nodded. The operations manager leaned forward. "That's excellent," he said. "Exactly what we needed." I watched quietly, not because I didn't care, but because I had begun to recognize something about the dynamic in the room. People weren't deliberately overlooking me, they were simply following the story that made the most sense to them. Claire was visible. She spoke often. She explained things clearly, and I had never stepped forward to change that narrative. So in their minds, the roles were obvious. Claire led the project. Matthew maintained the systems. Both useful, but only one is visible. After the meeting ended, I returned to my desk and opened the shared drive where the audit project lived. Inside that drive were dozens of folders I had carefully structured over the previous 9 months. Validation scripts, data integrity reports, automated checks, version histories documenting every change the system had gone through. The entire project was built like a set of gears, each piece connected to the next. If you understood how it worked, it was efficient and reliable. If you didn't, it was just a collection of files. I sat there for a moment, scrolling slowly through the directories. That was when the realization finally settled in. The role everyone had assigned me wasn't actually the problem. Being underestimated had advantages. It meant no one watched too closely. No one questioned how carefully the system was documented. No one paid attention to the quiet safeguards built into the structure, and for the first time since the project began, I started to see the situation from a slightly different perspective, not with frustration, but with clarity, because if everyone believed I was simply maintaining the system, they probably had no idea how well I actually understood it. The moment things changed didn't happen during a meeting. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic turning point where someone said the wrong thing. It happened on a quiet Wednesday evening. Most of the office had already gone home. The audit deadline was getting closer, and like usual, I had stayed a little later to review the data validation reports. That had become part of my routine over the past several months, running final checks after everyone else left, so the system would be clean the next morning. The building was almost silent, the kind of silence offices have after hours, when the fluorescent lights hum faintly and the air conditioning sounds louder than it does during the day. I had 3 monitors open, each displaying different parts of the audit system. One showed the reporting dashboard, another showed the raw data feeds, and the third displayed the shared drive where the entire project lived. That was when something caught my attention. A notification appeared in the corner of the screen. File structure modified. It wasn't unusual. People accessed the shared drive throughout the day, but the timestamp told me the change had happened just a few minutes earlier, which was strange, because almost everyone had already left. Curious, I opened the activity log. The log listed every folder interaction, edits, uploads, renames, and deletions. It was one of the safeguards I had built into the system months earlier. Not because I expected problems, but because complex projects benefit from traceability. The most recent entry showed a familiar username, Claire D. She had reorganized one of the outer folders connected to the audit project. Nothing critical had been changed, just a minor adjustment to the way a reporting directory was labeled. Technically harmless, but as I studied the log more closely, I noticed something else. Claire had accessed the system several times that week when I wasn't around. Not unusual by itself, but the pattern stood out. She wasn't editing the validation scripts. She wasn't adjusting the models. She was mostly navigating, opening folders, reviewing structures, looking around, almost like someone trying to understand a system they hadn't built. I leaned back slightly in my chair. For the first time, a quiet thought crossed my mind. Claire wasn't just presenting the project in meetings anymore. She was trying to position herself inside it, and that realization changed something for me. Up until that evening, I had been treating the situation as a minor office dynamic, the kind of thing that eventually corrects itself when reality catches up. But systems don't correct themselves automatically. People shape them, narratives shape them, and if I stayed passive, the story around this project would continue drifting in the same direction it had been drifting for weeks. The difference was that now I understood something clearly. Claire might know how to talk about the project, but I was the only person who truly understood how it worked. Every dependency, every hidden safeguard, every backup routine quietly protects months of work. I closed the activity log and looked at the folder tree one more time. 9 months of effort, hundreds of hours, carefully structured and quietly maintained. That evening, I didn't change anything. I didn't send emails. I didn't confront anyone. But something inside me had shifted. Silence, I realized, didn't always have to mean passivity. Sometimes it could mean patience. After that evening, my behavior in the office didn't change in any obvious way. I still arrived at the same time each morning. Still sat at the same desk near the window, still worked quietly through datasets and validation reports, while the rest of the team moved through meetings, calls, and presentations. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same. But internally, something had shifted. Before that night, my silence had mostly been instinctive, part personality, part habit. I avoided unnecessary conflict and trusted that good work would eventually speak for itself. After that night, the silence became something different. It became intentional. I stopped assuming the situation would correct itself naturally. Instead, I began paying closer attention to how people interacted with the project. Claire's confidence in meetings continued to grow. By this point, most discussions about the audit preparation started with her. Managers would ask for updates, and she would summarize the project's progress in broad terms. The system is running smoothly. We've already tested the validation layers. The reporting structure should handle the auditor's review. None of those statements was technically wrong, but they were always incomplete, and no one in the room seemed to notice the difference. Meanwhile, my role quietly remained the same. When a dataset didn't reconcile correctly, Someone asked me to check it. When a report needed adjustment, the file appeared in my inbox. When the reporting dashboard lagged or an automated check failed, I was the one who rebuilt the connections. The team relied on the system, and the system relied on me. Yet the perception of ownership in the room continued drifting toward the person who spoke about it most confidently. Oddly enough, that realization no longer bothered me the way it had a few weeks earlier. Instead, it made the situation feel clearer, predictable. When people underestimate someone, they also stop watching them closely. They stop asking detailed questions. They stop noticing the smaller mechanics that keep complex systems functioning. That invisibility gave me something valuable: space. Over the next several weeks, I began doing what I had always done, but with slightly more awareness. I documented everything, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, just carefully. Version histories stayed organized, file dependencies remained mapped, change logs continued updating quietly inside the system. If anyone had looked closely, they would have seen a project that was exceptionally well documented, but no one looked that closely. Most people were focused on the approaching audit deadline, and Claire was focused on preparing the final presentation that would explain the system to leadership and external reviewers. Meanwhile, I continued maintaining the machinery behind that presentation, running checks, monitoring activity logs, making sure every piece of the structure worked exactly as intended. The interesting thing about silence is that people often interpret it in the simplest way possible. They see quietness and assume passivity. They see patience and assume hesitation. They see someone who doesn't interrupt meetings and assume that person has nothing to add. But silence can also mean something else entirely. It can mean someone is simply waiting until the right moment, waiting until the system reveals what it was always going to reveal. And by then, the audit deadline was getting very close. Close enough that small mistakes would start carrying much larger consequences. By the time the audit was a month away, the project had reached the stage where small details mattered more than big ideas. The structure was already built, the models were already running. What remained was maintenance, checking, documenting, refining. For most people on the team, that phase felt routine. For me, it was where the real work lived. Every morning, I opened the same folders and ran through the same quiet checklist. Data reconciliation reports, validation scripts, audit preparation dashboards. Each layer of the system depended on the next, like gears inside a machine that only worked when everything turned together. And the more I maintained it, the more I realized something important. Almost no one else in the office understood how those gears actually connected, not because they weren't capable, but because they had never needed to. From the outside, the system looked simple. Reports went in, dashboards came out, inconsistencies were flagged automatically. Managers saw clean visuals and summarized numbers. Claire saw a structure she could explain clearly during meetings. But the real architecture was hidden deeper in the folders. Validation layers linked to historical data sets, scripts that cross-checked reporting errors, automated safeguards that prevented accidental overwrites, and most importantly, detailed version histories. Those histories tracked every change the system had ever gone through. Who edited what, when files are moved, when something was deleted. Months earlier, when I first built the framework, I had also structured the project to integrate with our server backup system. It wasn't something I talked about much. It was simply good practice for long-term projects. The company's system administrator, Daniel, had been upgrading the internal storage protocols at the time. During one of our conversations about folder permissions, he mentioned the new backup schedule they were implementing. Automatic snapshots. Multiple versions are stored across separate servers. Quiet redundancies are designed to prevent catastrophic data loss. At the time, I had simply nodded and said that sounded helpful, but I also made sure the audit project folders were mapped correctly into that system, just in case. Weeks later, as I worked through my daily checks, I occasionally glanced at the activity logs again. Claire's access to the project had become more frequent. She opened dashboards, reviewed folder structures, sometimes reorganized outer directories to make them cleaner for presentations. Nothing she did broke the system, but she was clearly becoming more comfortable navigating it. And that was when I started noticing something subtle. Claire interacted with the project almost entirely through the top layer, the visible parts, the reports, the dashboards, the presentations. She rarely opened the deeper validation scripts, rarely touched the underlying data sets, rarely examined the logs. In other words, she understood the surface of the system very well, but the infrastructure underneath it remained invisible to her. And not just to her, to almost everyone. During meetings, managers talked about the audit preparation as if the system were a finished product. Something stable, simple, ready to present. They saw the dashboard slides. They saw the clean reports. They saw Claire confidently explaining how everything worked. What they didn't see were the quiet layers underneath that made those presentations possible. The safeguards, the logs, the backups, the careful documentation. Those things rarely attract attention, because when they work properly, nothing goes wrong. But that's the strange thing about complex systems. The moment something does go wrong, those hidden layers suddenly become the most important part of the entire structure. At the time, I wasn't expecting anything dramatic to happen. I was simply maintaining the system the way I always had. Carefully, quietly, making sure everything was traceable, making sure every change left a record, making sure nothing could truly disappear without leaving a footprint. Because whether people realized it or not, 9 months of work were sitting inside that shared drive. And systems that are valuable tend to attract attention in ways no one anticipates. The discovery that changed everything didn't happen during a crisis. There was no alarm, no urgent email, no moment where someone rushed across the office asking for help. It happened quietly, late on a Friday afternoon. Most of the team had already started winding down for the weekend. Conversations in the office had shifted away from work toward dinner plans, family visits, and the small relief that comes when a long week finally ends. I was doing what I usually did before leaving, running one last check through the audit system. The process had become almost automatic by then. Open the validation logs, scan the latest data imports, and confirm that the automated reports have been generated correctly. But that afternoon, I decided to open something I hadn't looked at closely in a while, the server snapshot directory. Daniel, the system administrator, had mentioned weeks earlier that the company's upgraded backup infrastructure was now fully operational. Every major project folder connected to the internal server was automatically copied at regular intervals. Quietly, without interrupting the active files. Most people in the office barely thought about it. Backups are one of those invisible safety nets that only matter when something goes wrong. Still, curiosity led me to open the directory. Inside were multiple time-stamped archives of the audit project, daily snapshots, weekly full copies. Every version of the project is preserved in the background. I clicked on one of the folders from 2 weeks earlier. The entire structure appeared instantly. Every dataset, every validation script, every report exactly as it had existed that day. Nothing missing, nothing altered. I opened another snapshot from a month earlier, same result, perfectly preserved. For a moment, I just sat there studying the screen. Not because I had expected something different, but seeing it so clearly made a few things suddenly obvious. If something happened to the active files on the shared drive, the entire project could be restored. Not partially. Completely. The system didn't just protect against technical failure, it protected against human mistakes, accidental overwrites, misplaced folders, even large-scale deletions. The backups existed outside the visible workspace, quietly mirroring everything that happened inside it, and that realization created a strange kind of calm. Up until that point, the audit project had always felt fragile. Months of work were stored inside a structure that most people didn't fully understand. But now, I knew something no one else seemed to realize. The work was safer than it looked. Even if someone tried to disrupt the system, intentionally or accidentally, the infrastructure behind it had already accounted for that possibility. I closed the snapshot folders and leaned back slightly. The office around me was nearly empty now. A few lights had been turned off down the hall. Someone laughed near the elevators before the doors closed. Just another quiet Friday. For a moment, I thought about Claire, her growing confidence in meetings, her increasing access to the project folders, her presentations explaining how the system worked. None of that bothered me anymore, because I now understood something fundamental about the situation. Perception and control are not the same thing. Someone can appear to lead a project, appear to understand its structure, appear to hold ownership over the narrative surrounding it. But real control lives somewhere deeper, inside the systems, inside the documentation, Inside the safeguards no one pays attention to, and in this case, the most important safeguard of all was already running quietly in the background, automatic, unnoticed, protecting every piece of work in the project. I shut down my monitor and gathered my bag. At the time, I still didn't know how important that discovery would become, but a few days later, 3 days before the audit, something happened that would make those backups the most important detail in the entire story. The moment that forced a decision came faster than I expected. It was Monday morning, 3 days before the external audit. The office felt different that day, tighter, more focused. You could sense the pressure in small ways. Shorter conversations, more people checking calendars, more managers walking between desks, asking quick questions about progress. Audits have a way of doing that to companies. Even well-prepared teams start double-checking everything. I had just finished reviewing the overnight data reconciliation when our project manager stopped by my desk. "Matthew," he said, "we're doing one last internal walkthrough this afternoon. Claire's presenting the audit structure to leadership again before the auditors arrive." I nodded. "Sounds good." Technically, the system was ready, every validation layer was functioning, the reporting dashboards were clean, and the documentation folders were organized exactly the way auditors prefer. If everything continued normally, the audit would probably go smoothly, but that was the interesting part. By this stage, the narrative inside the office had already settled. If the audit went well, most people would associate the success with the person who had been presenting the system in meetings, Claire. And if something went wrong, well, the systems themselves would become the focus, the quiet infrastructure behind the presentations, which meant the attention would eventually drift toward me. I wasn't angry about that possibility, but it made something clear. For months, I had allowed the story around this project to evolve naturally. I stayed quiet. I focused on maintaining the system and let others interpret the work however they wanted. But with the audit approaching, the stakes were higher now. 9 months of effort were about to face external scrutiny, and the perception surrounding that effort had drifted further from reality than I had originally expected. So I asked myself a simple question: what would happen if I continued doing nothing? The answer was obvious. The audit would happen. Claire would present the structure. Leadership would assume the project belonged primarily to her, and the quiet mechanics behind it, the documentation, the safeguards, the infrastructure, would remain largely invisible. Not wrong, just incomplete. But the truth was, I had another option. Not confrontation, not accusations, just clarity. The system I had built contained everything necessary to show exactly how the project had developed over time. Version histories, activity logs, change records. Every modification is connected to a timestamp and a username. The project had quietly documented its own story from the beginning. All I had to decide was whether that story should remain buried inside the logs, or whether it should eventually surface. That was the decision point. And strangely, once I looked at it that way, the answer felt simple. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to interrupt meetings or challenge anyone directly. All I needed to do was exactly what I had always done: maintain the system, let it record everything. And if something unexpected happened during the final days before the audit, the truth would already be sitting quietly inside the infrastructure, waiting. So I closed the activity logs and returned to my work. 3 days remained before the auditors arrived. At the time, I had no idea how quickly the situation was about to test the system and everyone's assumptions about it. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of quiet tension that spreads through an office when a deadline is close enough to feel real. The audit was now 2 days away. By then, most of the preparation work was finished. The datasets had been validated, the reporting dashboards finalized, and the documentation folders arranged in the structure auditors usually prefer: clear, chronological, and easy to navigate. Claire spent most of that morning preparing for the final walkthrough presentation with leadership. I saw her moving between conference rooms with her laptop, rehearsing slides and adjusting talking points. From a distance, everything looked perfectly organized. Meanwhile, my morning looked almost identical to the one before it. I opened the shared drive, ran the validation scripts, checked the overnight data imports, confirmed that every reporting layer was functioning correctly. It was the quiet work no one paid much attention to. but it was also the work that ensured the system would survive real scrutiny once the auditors arrived. Around mid-morning, our project manager stopped by again. "Matthew, quick favor," he said. "Claire's finalizing the presentation. Can you double-check that the reporting dashboards are synced with the latest data set?" "Already running the check," I replied. He nodded, relieved. "Perfect." That was the thing about complex systems. When they function smoothly, people assume they're simple. They see clean outputs and organized reports without noticing the dozens of invisible checks running beneath them. By lunchtime, the office atmosphere had shifted slightly. Leadership had approved the final presentation. The audit documentation folders were ready. Most people believed the hardest part of the project was behind us, but I kept doing what I had been doing for months. Monitoring the system quietly, running checks, reviewing activity logs when something caught my attention, not because I expected a problem, but because experience had taught me something important about large projects. The most fragile moments often happen right before completion. That afternoon, while running one of the final validation reports, I opened the activity log again out of habit. A few new entries appeared. Claire had accessed several folders connected to the audit preparation files. Nothing unusual there. She had been reviewing those folders regularly as part of preparing the presentation, but I noticed something small. She had opened a few directories deeper inside the structure than usual. Validation layers, archive folders, older versions of reports. It looked like someone was trying to trace the full structure of the system before explaining it to outsiders. Again, nothing harmful, just curiosity. Still, I made sure the logs were recording everything properly. Every folder access, every file edit, every movement inside the system. Not because I was suspicious, just because that's how good systems are built. They remember things even when people forget. By the time the afternoon ended, most of the team left feeling confident. 2 days. That was all that remained before the auditors arrived. 9 months of work had been reduced to a set of folders, dashboards, and presentations, waiting to be reviewed. From the outside, everything appeared stable, controlled, ready. But complex systems have a strange way of revealing their true importance at the exact moment no one expects it. And the next morning, something inside that shared drive was about to change in a way no one in the office was prepared for. Wednesday morning started with the kind of quiet urgency that only appears when something important is less than 48 hours away. The audit was scheduled for Friday. By 8:30, most of the team had already arrived. Coffee cups appeared on desks, laptops opened, and the usual low murmur of conversations filled the office floor. I sat down at my desk and began the same routine I had followed for months. Open the shared drive, run the validation scripts, check the overnight reports. The system normally took a few seconds to load the audit project folders. That morning, it took longer. At first, I assumed the server was just slow. It happened occasionally, when too many people accessed the drive at once. But when the directory finally opened, something immediately looked wrong. Several folders were missing, not moved, missing. I scrolled slowly through the directory tree again. The validation models folder was gone. The audit preparation datasets folder was gone. The report generation scripts folder, the one containing months of configuration files, had disappeared entirely. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. 9 months of work, gone from the shared drive. A few seconds later, the first voice echoed across the office. "Hey, is anyone else missing files in the audit folder?" Another voice followed. "Wait, yeah, my reports aren't opening." Within 30 seconds, the quiet office atmosphere dissolved into confusion. Chairs rolled across the floor. Several people opened the shared drive at once, searching for the same directories. Claire's voice rose from the other side of the room. "Where are the model folders?" Someone replied. "I thought you reorganized them yesterday." "I didn't delete anything," she said quickly. The room grew noticeably louder. Our project manager walked over to Claire's desk. "What's going on?" "I don't know," she said, scrolling through the drive. "The audit files were here yesterday." People began opening backup spreadsheets, checking shortcuts, and refreshing the drive. Nothing appeared. The main audit structure had been wiped clean, not partially, almost completely. The only remaining folders were a few surface-level directories that contained presentation slides and empty templates. The infrastructure underneath, the real system, was gone. For a few seconds, no one said anything. Then someone muttered the sentence everyone was thinking. If those files are actually gone, They didn't finish the thought. They didn't have to. Rebuilding 9 months of audit preparation in 48 hours was impossible. Our project manager turned slowly toward me. Matthew, do you know what happened? Several people in the room looked in the same direction, not because they suddenly understood the system, but when technical things break, people instinctively look toward the person who usually fixes them. I glanced calmly at the screen again. The activity log window was already open. Inside it, a long list of actions appeared. Folder deletions, file removals, directory restructuring, all recorded with timestamps, and attached to each action was a username, Claire. The entries continued for several minutes, a cascade of deletions moving deeper and deeper through the system. It looked like someone navigating a structure they didn't fully understand, and removing pieces of it, one folder at a time. Across the room, Claire was still refreshing the drive, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to alarm. "This doesn't make sense," she said quietly. No one responded immediately, because in that moment, the entire team believed the same thing. The audit project had just been destroyed. But as I looked at the empty folders on the shared drive, one detail remained perfectly clear in my mind. What they were seeing wasn't the whole system. It was only the visible layer, and the most important parts of that system had never been stored in just one place. The office stayed strangely quiet for the next few minutes. Not silent. People were still clicking through folders, refreshing the shared drive, opening old email attachments. But the energy in the room had shifted. The casual confidence from earlier that morning was gone. In its place was something much heavier, uncertainty. Our project manager stood behind Claire's desk, watching the screen as she navigated through the remaining folders. "This can't be right," she said, her voice lower now. "Maybe the files were moved." "Search for the directory names," he suggested. She did. Nothing appeared. Someone across the room tried searching the company server index. Still nothing. Within 10 minutes, the entire team had realized something important. The files weren't misplaced. They had been deleted. You could see it on people's faces. That quiet moment when a problem stops being confusing and starts becoming serious. One of the analysts spoke first. "If those models are gone, the auditors can't verify anything," another added quietly. "We'd have to rebuild the validation system." Our manager exhaled slowly. "That's months of work." No one said anything after that, because everyone understood the timeline. The auditors were arriving in 2 days. Even if the team worked around the clock, recreating the full structure of the project in that time wasn't realistic. Claire leaned back in her chair, staring at the empty folders on her screen. "I was just cleaning up the directories yesterday," she said. "I thought some of the archive folders were duplicates." Her voice had lost the confidence it usually carried in meetings. Now, it sounded careful, measured, like someone trying to understand how a small action had turned into something much larger. Our manager asked the obvious question, "Did you delete anything?" "I removed a few old folders," she said quickly, "but I didn't think they were connected to the main system." That was the problem with complex infrastructures. From the outside, they often look like simple collections of files. But once the internal dependencies break, the entire structure collapses. Around the room, people began discussing emergency options. Maybe IT can recover something. Do we have an older copy somewhere? Was anyone keeping local backups? Every suggestion carried the same quiet hope. Maybe something survived. Maybe part of the work could still be recovered. But none of those possibilities sounded certain. Eventually, our project manager turned back toward me. "Matthew, you built most of the validation system. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. Do you know if any of this can be restored?" Several heads turned again, not dramatically, just slowly, because when systems break, the room eventually looks toward the person who understands them best. Across the office, Claire was staring at the activity log now. Her username appeared again and again in the deletion entries. Minute after minute of recorded actions. Folders removed, directories cleared. The evidence was simple, unavoidable. And the worst part was that none of it could be undone from the shared drive. Once files are deleted, they disappear completely. Claire's shoulders lowered slightly as she looked at the log. "I didn't realize," she murmured. No one interrupted her, because by then, everyone believed the same thing. 9 months of preparation had just been erased 2 days before the audit. and nothing inside the visible system could bring it back. But what the room still didn't realize was that the visible system had never been the only place the project existed. For a moment, no one moved. The office had reached that strange pause that sometimes happens when a problem becomes too large to process all at once. People were still standing near their desks, screens open, activity logs visible, but the usual background noise had faded. Claire was the first person to speak again. "I didn't know those folders were connected to the system," she said quietly, still looking at the screen. "I thought they were old archives." No one immediately responded. Our project manager looked back at me. "Matthew," he said carefully, "is there anything we can do here?" His tone had changed. Not demanding, not accusatory, just direct. I turned my chair slightly toward the group. "I'd like to check something first," I said. No one objected. I reopened the activity log window and scrolled through the entries. The sequence was exactly what it looked like earlier. Several minutes of deletions, one folder after another, moving deeper into the structure until the entire system had collapsed. The logs had recorded everything: timestamp, user account, file path, nothing hidden. Across the room, Claire finally turned away from the screen. "I honestly thought I was cleaning things up," she said. The folders looked redundant. Her voice wasn't defensive anymore, just unsettled. I nodded once. "I understand. And I meant it. Complex systems are easy to misunderstand when you only see the surface." Our manager rubbed his forehead briefly. "So, are we starting over?" he asked. "No," I said calmly. That single word changed the energy in the room. Several people looked up. "What do you mean?" someone asked. I turned my monitor slightly so the project manager could see it. "There's another copy of the project." Claire blinked. "Another copy?" I opened the directory where the server snapshots were stored. Rows of dated folders appeared on the screen. Daily backups, weekly archives, entire versions of the project were preserved exactly as they had existed before the deletions. The room stayed quiet for a moment as people processed what they were seeing. "The system administrator set up automatic server snapshots a few weeks ago," I explained. "The audit folders were included in that structure." Our manager leaned closer to the screen. "You're saying everything is still there?" "Yes." Claire looked from the monitor back to me. "All of it?" "All of it." The tension that had been building across the office didn't explode the way you might expect. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just a long breath from the project manager. "Can it be restored?" "It can," I said. "The snapshot from yesterday afternoon still contains the full system." The manager nodded slowly. "Then let's restore it." I turned back toward my keyboard and began the recovery process. Behind me, the room remained unusually quiet, not because people were afraid, but because something had shifted. For months, most of the office had believed they understood exactly how the audit system worked. Now they were realizing that the most important parts of it had always been happening somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter, and they had only just noticed. The restoration process took less time than anyone expected. Once the correct server snapshot was selected, the system administrator simply rolled the project folder back to the previous version. Within minutes, the empty directories on the shared drive began filling again. Validation models reappeared. Datasets returned. Report scripts restored themselves exactly where they had been the day before. 9 months of work quietly rebuilt itself on the screen. Around the office, people watched as the structure came back to life. Not dramatically. There was no applause, no celebration, just the subtle relief that spreads through a room when a crisis dissolves. Our project manager stood behind my desk as the final folders synced. "Looks like everything's back," he said. I ran one more validation check to be certain. The scripts executed normally, dashboards loaded, reports were generated exactly as they had before. "Everything's intact," I confirmed. He nodded slowly. "Good work, Matthew." It wasn't a grand statement, just a simple acknowledgement before he walked off to update leadership. The office gradually returned to its usual rhythm. People went back to their desks, reopened their tasks, and continued preparing for the audit, as if the morning's panic had simply been a temporary interruption. But something subtle had changed. Conversations around the project sounded slightly different now. When someone had a question about the audit system, they came directly to me. When a report needed confirmation, they asked me to review it. The attention wasn't loud or dramatic, just more accurate. Claire remained quiet for most of the afternoon. At one point, she walked over to my desk. "I didn't realize how interconnected everything was," she said. Her voice sounded more reflective than defensive. It's complicated, I replied. She nodded. I should have asked before touching those folders. There wasn't much else to say. Mistakes happen in offices all the time. Most of them come from assumptions rather than bad intentions. What mattered more was what people learned afterward. The audit itself happened 2 days later. The auditors reviewed the documentation, checked the validation reports, and walked through the dashboards exactly as planned. The system held up under their questions without any issues. From the outside, the project looked exactly the way it was supposed to look: clean, organized, reliable. After the audit ended, the office slowly moved on to new projects, new deadlines, and new routines. But for me, the experience left a lasting impression, not because of the panic that morning, and not because of the moment the backups restored everything. What stayed with me was something quieter. For months, I had been seen as the quiet person maintaining the system in the background. And in many ways, that description had been true. The difference now was that I understood something about that role more clearly than before. Being quiet doesn't mean being invisible. Sometimes it just means you're paying attention to the parts of the system that other people overlook, and when those parts matter most. The room eventually notices. Looking back on that week now, the strangest part isn't the moment the files disappeared. It's how quiet everything felt when they came back. No dramatic apology, no big meeting where someone explained what happened. The system was restored, the audit moved forward, and the office continued exactly the way offices usually do. One project ending, while another quietly begins. But something about the experience stayed with me long after the audit finished. For months, I had been working in the background of that project, maintaining systems, organizing structures, documenting changes that most people never saw. From the outside, it probably looked like I was just supporting the work others were presenting, and in some ways, that was true. But the situation taught me something I think a lot of people discover at some point in their careers. The most important work in any system often happens where no one is looking. The safeguards, the documentation, the quiet preparation that prevents small mistakes from turning into disasters. Those things rarely get attention when everything is running smoothly, but when something breaks, suddenly they become the difference between chaos and recovery. What happened that Wednesday morning could have destroyed months of preparation. Instead, it became a reminder of why careful work matters, even when it goes unnoticed. And maybe that's the real takeaway from the whole experience. Not revenge, not proving someone wrong, just the quiet reality that systems and people often reveal their true value in the moments when things go wrong. I'm still the same person I was before that project. Still quiet in meetings, still more comfortable fixing problems than talking about them. But now I understand something a little more clearly. Being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes it simply means people haven't seen the whole picture yet. And eventually, when the moment comes, the work tends to speak for itself. So I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where people underestimated your role until the moment they suddenly realized how important it actually was?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.